We all know that the NFL is a bandwagon league. It's a copycat league. You see a trick play come out that's a novelty that some offensive coordinator came up in the middle of the season and implemented into a game, and it was successful. And you'll see 2 or 3 or even 4 teams run that exact same play or a very slight variant of it within the next week. And that is indicative of the way that the NFL is. The NFL, for the longest time, has always tried to take whatever player, whatever scheme, and whatever coach is being successful and replicate that to make a clone, for example. Back in the 60s, my own team's owner, Al Davis, the original owner of the team, was also known for this, as was everybody else. And this wasn't a bad thing. As an example, in the 60s, during the draft, Al Davis made a historic trade with Buffalo to get Darryl LaMonica, who was basically a clone of Joe Namath, who is, by all rights, the one that Al Davis wanted originally, but wasn't able to get. And so therefore, he took the best thing that he could get, which was Darryl LaMonica. In that very same draft, Al Davis drafted Gene Upshaw, a massive mountain of a man, in order to combat what the Kansas City Chiefs were doing. And so fast forward that today, as his son Mark Davis tried to copy what was so successful in New England and bring the Patriot way here in a disastrous move with Josh McDaniels. Now, with that being said, we also know that this doesn't just apply to trick plays, schemes, or even replicating players, which we're seeing now. Everybody wants the next Patrick Mahomes. But it also happens with coaches. And I'm calling this the Antonio Pierce, Dan Campbell effect in the NFL. You see, everybody is familiar with what Dan Campbell was able to do in turning around the Detroit Lions and making them a contender in deep into the playoffs, all the way to the national championship, and only barely losing to the 49ers. But what Dan Campbell has brought more than just winning, he's brought an entire culture change to that organization. And the same can be said for my very own Antonio Pierce with my beloved Raiders. Mid-season, Antonio Pierce took over a team that was in utter shambles because of the Josh McDaniels disaster. He was able to take a team that didn't trust the system, players who had given up and didn't want to even further risk injury because they knew by the end of this losing season, they would probably be gone anyway.
Man, I'm tired of dealing with this shit. Like, every day I come here and bust my ass. I see the guys, bust their ass, and the result is not there.
Or request a trade, because the culture inside that locker room under McDaniels had become so toxic. And not towards players, but players towards the coach. And so Mark Davis, listening to his players and realizing that this wasn't going to work, fired McDaniels. He made the right call, because he then elevated a linebacker coach named Antonio Pierce to the interim head coach position. And this was an instantaneous change in the mood and the feeling in that locker room, as stated by Raiders players themselves. They felt as though a weight had been lifted off their shoulders, because Antonio's, he spoke their language. And I'm not talking about colloquial. He understood the players' language, what it meant to put on that uniform and don that helmet and go to battle for your brothers, your friends, your fans who are screaming and cheering, and we're paying our hard-earned money. Some of us can barely even afford to go to a game. We live check to check, and we're spending that money because they're our relief from the hardships of life. And they understand that. And it was completely night and day difference. The NFL has been ruled by the old school Bill Belichick's of the NFL. And that's changing. Bill Belichick no longer works in today's modern NFL. The players, they need a leader of men instead of a dictator. In the past in the NFL, it was okay to have a dictator because you trusted that this guy was so smart that what he said, it was gold. If you just followed the program, you'd be a champion. You'd be immortalized. You'd be a Hall of Famer because he knows what he's doing. But that's not the case anymore because it's no longer about run the ball, run the ball, run the ball, throw. Now it's about schemes. Now it's about tricking. And now it's so much more complicated and fluid. Now we have Patrick Mahomes completely upending the entire NFL. Now every single coach wants the next Patrick Mahomes. So you have to adjust to the times with your NFL coach. You see, when Tom Brady's career came to an end in New England could not muster up a playoff run. They couldn't do anything with Bill Belichick because Tom Brady was a different animal. He didn't need Bill Belichick. Bill Belichick needed him. And without him, we see what Bill Belichick is now. Look, the Patriots, they've always had a Bill Belichick type of coach. From Bill Parcells to Pete Carroll before he went back to college and then on to Seattle, this was the modus operandi for the Patriots. But look at who their coach is now. Gerard Mayo, another former player who was basically a low-ranking assistant, is now the head coach. Why? Because it's the Dan Campbell, Antonio Pierce effect on the NFL. It's a copycat league. The owner realized that they could not go with another Bill Belichick, and they definitely seen that bringing Josh McDaniels back to the Patriots as the head coach was not going to be a winning formula. He's failed in Denver and then had a perfect situation in the Raiders and destroyed it. So kudos to the Patriot organization for learning from others' mistakes and not doing that to their organization and elevating a guy like Gerard Mayo. Now, the question really is going to be, will the Antonio Pierce, Dan Campbell, Gerard Mayo, will these type of coaches, the players, former players turned head coaches, and they speak the language, they're leaders of men, will they be successful and will it turn into championships? Well, in Dan Campbell's case, he got pretty darn close all the way to the NFC Championship, only losing by a few points. With Antonio Pierce, it's too soon to say. But as a Raider fan, I've never been more excited for the future of the Raiders than I am with the Raiders under the tutelage of a guy like Antonio Pierce. a guy who had to work for everything, a guy who went undrafted into the NFL to becoming a Pro Bowler and a Super Bowl champion, a captain of his team. And now he's a captain of our team. In the Patriots regard, will Mayo work out for them? Too early to tell because we don't have any games to evaluate his leadership on as a head coach like we do with Dan Campbell and Antonio Pierce. But I'm excited for the NFL that we are finally moving away from the dictator head coach to the players coach. I think it's going to make for much more exciting and invigorated football, because when you have a team who will run through a brick wall for their coach, it's definitely going to be more entertaining to watch. You've been watching the Raider D podcast, and you know what to do.
Just win, baby.